Hello and welcome to episode 313 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Parrott, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum at Camp Shelby. And with me, as always, is my esteemed co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore of Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many other postings. How are you this fine November morning, Bill?
I'm doing great, Seth. I appreciate the opportunity to do this today. Really important topic. Now, I know somebody's going to ask about my voice, and so I'll to tell you up front that I've had lung problems since just a few days after 9/11, and they've been in there's nothing serious, no cancer or anything like that, but it comes and goes, and it's back, and so I'm back on a medicine that tends to kind of scorch my vocal cords. It doesn't hurt. It's not dangerous. It's just the way it is, and so I apologize for my earthy voice. Is that a good way to describe it, Seth?
Earthy is a good voice, a good term, but I prefer the rugged sea captain. I prefer the rugged sea captain.
Right, yeah, even better, even better.
Yeah,
thank you.
Because it fits, it fits. It fits.
But at least it used to.
It works. It works. You sound great.
Yeah.
But in all seriousness, obviously everybody hopes that you do feel better, if you will. If you're watching, you can see we have a third member on our audience here, as always, and we're always glad to have him here with us, and we're happy that he is here. Jon Parshall, how are you this fine November morning?
I'm just splendid. Yeah, that's the party line. I'm splendid.
Splendid. Well, it's better than being not splendid. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So, before we get started, as we always do, we do want to ask you to like and subscribe to our channel. Please do hit that subscribe button. We're seeing a lot of views in our videos, and that is outstanding. Thank you very, very much for that. But please click that subscribe button, as it does help us out. Before we get started, I just want to say as we record this just occurred to me, Bill, this is Thanksgiving week. Today is Tuesday. Thanksgiving's 2 days from now. And not to sound corny or hokey or anything, but and I know you feel the same way, Bill. I'm very thankful for all of our viewers, all of our listeners, all of our friends who've been on these shows that we've had, because without everybody that's participated, we would probably not still be doing this. So
I agree. I mean, there's nothing corny about that, Seth. We recently exceeded 3.1 million YouTube views, and if we add the audio plays, we're approaching 4 million. And I think that certainly puts us in the top 10 of World War II podcasts, and that's just a remarkable place to be, given that we thought when we started this it was a fool's errand. And we'd be doing it a few months and we'd give it up in frustration. That's not the way it played out.
No, it hasn't, and I'm very grateful for the fact that people are interested in what we have to say. I mean, I'm not arrogant enough to think I'm arrogant, believe me, but I'm not arrogant enough to think that people tune in to watch me. They probably watch my dog who's laying behind me right here, but certainly not watch me. They're here to digest the history that we present. And, again, I'll say this to the day I die, I'll stand behind the accuracy of everything we've said. Have we made a mistake here and there? Yeah. I mean, we're only human. And 99% of the time, yeah, we got notes, but we're riffing off the top of our heads. So sometimes you say the wrong thing, even though you know the right thing, you say the wrong thing. So it is what it is.
And it's harder for me, Seth, because I don't have the history background that you do. Interestingly, as you say that, though, we got an email from a Canadian historian just 2 days ago who said, I like, and he's a historian, right? I like listening to your podcast because it's the conversation I'd be having with two guys sitting in a bar. And all along, we've said that's exactly the format we're going for. Yeah. Two guys riffing in a bar about World War II, Pacific War history that we're interested and we're passionate about. So I'm glad it comes across that way.
For sure. And I mean, sometimes I see comments on our channel that say, you're too informal. Well, you know what? That's the way we are. I mean, I can be very formal and, stentorian if I so desire, but I don't do that. I'm just a regular dude, and, that's just the way we do things. So,
and those other 9 podcasts in the top 10 World War II podcasts, those guys read from scripts. If you want somebody reading from a script, watch one of those or listen to one of those. So that's not us.
Agreed. All right. Well, on with the show, Bill. We've got a lot to talk about today, and this is one I know that a lot of people have been very eager for us to dig into, and I myself have been eager to dig into it too, because it's just freaking cool. And at the basis of everything we've done, we talk about the Pacific War, obviously, and everything that we can, but the heart of our material has always, I think, been the naval battles, and this is one of the biggest ones of the entire war. So with that, let's get rolling. Operation Forager was at that time, which is to say June 1944, the largest, most complex, and perhaps riskiest operation of the Pacific War. It was an operation that tested the logistical and fighting prowess of the Pacific Fleet's amphibious arm and proved that the Alligator Navy under Kelly Turner was indeed the all-conquering force of the Pacific War. The Marines and soldiers ashore at Saipan and later Tinian and Guam slugged it out and ultimately destroyed the Japanese garrisons on all three of those Mariana Islands. And while the ground forces were pounding out an extremely bloody victory on Saipan, the world's most powerful naval force, that being Task Force 58, fought a little battle of its own, right smack in the middle of the Saipan operation. The naval battle that was fought in the seas around the Marianas from June 19th through the 20th, 1944, was a battle that, frankly, the United States hoped would come. The United States Navy hoped would come. For the Americans in Task Force 58, it was a battle that they were born to fight and built to fight. The years of learning in and around the waters of Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal in 1942 all led to this showdown in the summer of 1944. This would be the fight that the Big Blue Fleet would firmly plant its foot on the throat of the Imperial Navy once and for all. Or was it? For the Japanese, this was yet another chance at the almighty decisive battle that they had yearned for the past 2 years. The decisive battle that would wrest control of the Pacific War from the clutches of the American devils and allow the glorious empire to rise like a phoenix from the ashes, or so they said. This was an all-or-nothing game for the Imperial Navy. Their hope for victory and the life or death of the empire hung on this battle. The Battle of the Philippine Sea would start inauspiciously for the Japanese and only get worse. The first day of battle, which is what we're going to cover here today, in which the Japanese hung so much hope and so much faith had been planted, would end up in a rout and would become known to history as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Bill, this is the biggest carrier battle of the war, and as such, because there's so much stuff going on both days, we'd have a 4-hour podcast if we covered both days in one show. So we're splitting it up into two. So this is part one. This is Turkey Shoot. And then the next episode will be the Mission Beyond Darkness, which of course is June 20th. So Bill, this whole thing starts off with some really intriguing parts here. You know, there's some intelligence capture. There's some all kinds of, there's high level deaths. There's all kinds of stuff, intrigue and mystery and build up to this that leads to this big showdown. It's not just we flew out and shot down a bunch of planes. There's a lot of stuff that happened before. Tell us about some of this stuff. So this is Koga, Admiral Koga's, and this is his plan that starts this whole operation, isn't it?
It is. And Seth, you're right to say that this is high drama here, because I'm going to say this, I'm going to put air quotes around this. Everybody knows about the Marianas Turkey Shoot. At least our listeners and viewers are likely to know about it. But there's an aspect of it that we're going to talk about here in a moment that I doubt many people really know about. And you're correct. Admiral Koga, of course, had taken over as commander-in-chief of the combined fleet following the demise of Admiral Yamamoto in April 1943. He'd been careful with his forces, not committing them to a fleet engagement, except for one time in which he seriously contemplated it, that being, of course, the Aleutians, and we talked about that, and the Central Pacific. Now, as he witnessed the growth of the American Pacific Fleet, he played his cards more conservatively, closer to the best, husbanding his forces, removing his warships from Rabaul, particularly after the carrier raids, and relocating them to the Palaus, or the home islands, which was not, close to where he's going to engage here, all the while preparing for the almighty decisive battle that he hoped would reverse the fortunes of this war. Now, Koga realized that the tide of war had turned, and if the United States was to be defeated, the Imperial Navy would absolutely have to destroy the Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers. So he formulated a plan that would involve both carrier-based aircraft and land-based aircraft. Now, this is kind of a combined arms approach. And combined arms, even we were still kind of developing that doctrine and all the coordination and the command and control that goes along with a combined arms approach. And we were better than the Japanese were. And let's say that if this plan to coordinate both carrier-based and land-based aircraft were to work on the part of the Japanese, they would have to develop some really serious skills really fast, Seth.
Yeah, and command and control. You just said that's the key term here, because the Japanese, as we're going to see, don't have that ability. Not that I shouldn't say that they do have that ability. They don't possess that skill right now. So the overall strength and superiority of the Pacific Fleet was not lost on Admiral Koga. He was fully aware how big and powerful the Pacific Fleet had become. So, the fact that he has to throw in land-based and carrier-based aircraft for this decisive battle that he's trying yet again to wage is, a reflection of his knowledge of the Pacific Fleet and its overall size and power. John, the carrier forces for the Japanese had evolved quite a lot since 1942. When we left off at Santa Cruz, you said Santa Cruz was like halftime in a football game for the Pacific War's carrier battles, and very true, because we haven't had one since October 42. And the way the Japanese operated at Santa Cruz compared to how they're operating now in June of 1944 is vastly different, is it not?
Yeah, it is. And I think, this is sort of summarized by my co-author, Tony. He put it to me very succinctly once. He basically said that the Japanese battle plan for Phil C is do all the stuff that worked pretty well at Santa Cruz and don't do the stupid stuff that got us killed at Midway. So in terms of what's happened here with the Japanese carrier force, because you're right, I think there's this perception on the part of a lot of Americans that nothing has changed since 1942, but actually the Japanese have been doing a fair amount of thinking. So, among other things, when they came into the war, all of their aircraft operated in VIX of 3 aircraft, for instance, and since that time, they've gotten the clue from both the Germans and observing, operations in the European theater that nobody runs 3-plane VIX anymore. Everybody's doing this finger 4 jazz, so they make the move over to that tactical formation for their fighters in particular. They're going to make sure for this battle plan that they are going to be functionalizing their flight decks. So the 3 smaller carriers in the vanguard force ahead of the 2 big strike forces where Ozawa is flying his flag, those carriers are going to have aircraft on them that have crews that are specially trained to do scouting operations. The notion being that, we need to get the drop on the Americans and get our attacks in first, because that, by the conventional wisdom, that is the secret sauce for how you win a carrier battle, is you attack first. So he's got his scouting assets up front in the vanguard force. Meanwhile, groups A and B, his heavy carriers that are behind, are tasked with strike operations. And they've got aircraft that have got crews that are specially dedicated to those sorts of skill sets. They're going to be doing a lot of their operations on the flight deck because they learned their lesson at Midway that, getting caught with fueled and armed aircraft down in your hangars is a recipe for disaster. So they're going to keep doing that. Likewise, again, the vanguard force out in front of the main striking forces is designed as somewhat of a sump to absorb incoming American air attacks, because they've got, a lot of fairly heavily gunned anti-aircraft units out in front. And there's an analog here that, Willis Lee's battleship force is going to be used in exactly an analogous fashion by the Americans in this battle. So, the Japanese have been innovating. They've been evolving. They've integrated, at least now, the majority of their ships have radar. So they have an air warning capability on their carrier forces as well. They don't have anything, so far as we know, that is analogous with the way we view a combat information center, in that they have not yet integrated all these sensors into a centralized location to take those sensor inputs and disseminate that information out to the air fleet. They can't really do fighter vectoring in the same way that the Americans can, for instance. But, the bottom line is that their force has evolved. It has changed. They are thinking about how do we meet this new, what they think is going to be the threat environment that they're going to be up against, and bring what they conceive of as a modern carrier force into this fight.
And they're confident in this. Go ahead, Bill. Go ahead.
I was going to say, it sounds like a great plan.
Sounds like a great plan.
Right?
Yeah. No, they are very confident. Admiral Kusaka put it, on the eve of their sailing, that we so firmly believed in our victory that we nearly drank in celebration. As it turns out, those celebrations will be a little bit premature.
Indeed, because this is a beating of biblical proportions here this first day of Phil Sea. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
So the battle plan that Koga formulates is called the Z plan, and it's calls for a heavy Japanese naval response if the United States was to advance into either New Guinea, advance into the Philippine Sea from either New Guinea, the Palaus, or the Marianas. And this is basically, if we sail into those waters from any one of those three directions, the combined fleet's going to come out, and we're gonna whoop up on the Americans. This is something that he had been husbanding his forces, for the better part of over a year. To do this very, very thing. In March, he refines his plan, calls for all available Japanese naval air power. And this is something, it's literally all available Japanese air power, naval air power. Like everything under the kitchen sink.
Land-based and carrier-based, that's right. And so they're going to be shuttling aircraft in both from the home islands coming down north via Iwo Jima and ferrying them into the northern Marianas, Saipan and Rota particularly, and also in from the southwest, coming in through the Palaus via Yap and Ulithi to bring aircraft into Guam. So yeah, the idea is when the signal goes up, we're going to sortie the fleet. We're going to move as many land-based air assets into the Marianas as possible. And those land-based air assets are going to attrite the American fleet, give us time to get the combined fleet's carrier force into operation, and then we're going to fight this carrier battle.
Great plan, like Bill was saying.
He really is pushing his chips into the center of the table here.
This is all in. Yeah, for sure.
So it's like Bill had said a minute ago, it's a great plan if it works. And Koga, he was a pretty sharp guy. He wasn't the risk taker that Yamamoto was, but he was a pretty sharp dude. But there's a bit of intrigue, we talked about briefly in the beginning, that happens here. This is literally something out of a movie, but it actually does happen. Koga receives a scare in March of 1943, and by that I mean the Pacific Fleet raids the Palau area. It's a quick hit and run raid, but they come in there and they raid the Palau area. Koga initially fears that, oh Christ, this is the invasion, and I need to get the hell out of here. We need to move, and I need to move to the Philippines area. So he wants to go to Davao. He decides to move his headquarters to Davao. On March 31st, 1943, Koga and his staff board two big Kawanishi flying boats. They're at the flight from the Palaus to Mindanao to Mindanao is 3 hours long. En route, Koga's flight runs into like a typhoon or something, huh, John?
I think it's a really big storm, and what ends up happening is both aircraft end up crashing. And there have been conflicting accounts. Some people say that Koga disappeared completely, was never seen again. There are other Japanese accounts that say no, actually his plane went down, his body was eventually recovered, and he is buried in Japan. So I tend to believe those second accounts that say, yeah, he crashed due to weather, but they eventually recovered his body. But there's some real fallout from that, in that when his plane breaks up, gee whiz, all of the plans for this upcoming battle are in a wooden box that ends up floating around in the waters off the Philippines.
Mm-hmm. So the Z plan itself is in a leather-bound book.
Case in a box. Yeah.
Yeah, and the damn thing, sure enough, comes not washing ashore, but it close to where there's a Filipino native. I got his name here, and it is Pedro
Gontan
Gantengoko.
Goko, yeah.
God bless him.
Yeah,
A
gun
Cebu
time.
native. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a mouthful. A Cebu native. He finds the large wooden box floating close offshore. Now he has no earthly clue what the hell is in this thing.
Yeah.
Retrieving the box, Pedro soon found a waterlogged, leather-bound Japanese book. When he opens the book, he realizes this might be something relatively important.
Yeah.
So he hands that book over to an American guerrilla who's fighting by the name of Colonel James Cushing. Cushing realizes that, yeah, this is something that is relatively important, and he winds up getting it sent back to MacArthur's SWPA headquarters via submarine, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. And
yeah, I was just going to say, for the sake of our listeners, you know, what you're seeing here is that when in May 1942, the Philippines surrendered, and Jonathan Wainwright, you know, made his appeal to all of the Americans within the Philippine archipelago to lay down their arms. A lot of them are like, no, I ain't going to do that. And they went to the bush. And what ends up happening in 43 and 44 is we gradually get into contact with a lot of these guys because they're, you know, in touch with native guerrilla groups that are all through the archipelago. And we started using submarines to feed in radio sets. And so the communications now with the Philippine resistance is actually relatively good. And that's why this box ends up, you know, getting sent back to MacArthur's headquarters.
I saw a smile curl Bill's lips when you said submarine, but it's in all seriousness, they played a huge role in this.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was our coast watchers in the Philippines. That's right. A lot of guerrilla activity.
Right. And of course, the guerrilla activity, you know, we're segueing here. They're all different flavors of guerrillas. You know, there's communist guerrillas, there's democratic, you know, and a lot of them hate each other. But the Americans are interspersed with all of these bands. And so, yeah, there's this sort of loose confederation. The one thing they can agree on is we all hate the Japanese.
Right.
Boy, ain't that the truth.
Yeah.
So by April 13th, or on April 13th, rather, Cushing radios SWPA headquarters telling them he found, quote, some Japanese plans, unquote. On May 11th, the submarine Cravale surfaces, takes aboard some Filipino civilians and guerrillas and the bound copy of Koga's Z plan. Bill, it's translated quickly by May 22nd, as a matter of fact, and it's in Nimitz's hands through JICPOA. And then after that, things start to kind of ball up here. What the Japanese, even though we had their plans, they still didn't know how to necessarily execute those plans at that time.
Well, the big issue is they didn't know where where we would land, right? So they couldn't commit their forces until an actual invasion had been launched. And, you know, once the invasion, actually Task Force 58 was sighted at Majuro in the weeks before the Saipan operation. And so it had been noted that the massive fleet left the anchorage bound for parts unknown. But when the U.S. forces invaded Biak on May 27th, Japanese Admiral Toyoda, Koga's successor, felt that this was the expected landing and issued orders for Operation Cone. John, you know something about this Biak event, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is that Biak ends up really sort of wrong footing combined fleet. And this is, you know, yet another example of the benefits of having these two twin offensives that are going through the Pacific, one run by MacArthur, one run by Nimitz, is it constantly keeps the Japanese second guessing themselves as, you know, where's the next blow going to land? And so this is fortuitous for us in that, you know, Toyota gets all hot and bothered about Biak and starts marshaling forces to go down there, only to belatedly discover that, oh, gee, Saipan is now being heavily bombarded. It looks like the real battle is going to be up north instead.
But according to and this is something that's going to play heavily into the Turkey Shoot, is that Toyota moves a lot of aircraft from the Marianas towards that area, towards the Biak operation, the Biak invasion, which proves to be a huge miscalculation on the Japanese part and a blessing on our part. And you got to kind of wonder if the kills would have been higher, frankly. But regardless, there's less aircraft.
Right.
It's like a boxer dropping his arms to protect the body, and then the uppercut comes and hits the chin and knocks him out. And
Right.
that's kind of what's going to happen here.
Yeah. Yeah. Which
So good.
and if we're using boxing analogs, everybody has a plan until you get hit in the mouth, so
Exactly right. Until you get punched in the face.
get punched in
Yeah.
the face. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's kind of what's going to happen here on June 19th.
Yeah.
Bill, being a sailor, you know all too well about logistics and specifically fuel situations and things like that. The Japanese were sitting at this time of the war with a very precarious fuel. And I know, John, you're going to want to talk about this too. Very precarious fuel situation. The whole plan, the Z plan, is retermed as Operation A Go. And it's the fleet opposed invasion kind of operation here, to just put it down into simpler terms. But it all depends on the fuel situation for the combined fleet, and that plays a huge part in a lot of things, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, replaying a conversation we had in season 1, right? Japanese have the technical description for it is external lines of communication, which means all of this, fuel parts, people, they have to travel over the seas, which causes them to be subjected to submarine attack, which is very effective all the way through the war, right? And once our torpedoes started working. So yeah, we are attriting their fuel resources and everything else. The mobile fleet could not be reliably supplied at this point, unless they operate in close proximity to refineries, which were located in places like Tarakan, Balikpapan, and Palembang. Those are Malaysia, Indonesia.
Yeah. Indonesia and Sumatra and Borneo are where all these things are. And so, that ends up driving. That means that a substantial proportion of the Japanese heavy fleet units are located in southern waters at places like Tawi-Tawi, because those anchorages are proximate to those fuel fields. And in some cases, the Japanese are no longer have the capacity to refine this fuel, which means that they're using raw distillates that are, just pumping straight into the bunkers and using this stuff as fuel. Good news is that I forget if it was Borneo crude that was the good stuff, you could actually use it in this fashion without refining. The bad news is that it's got a fairly high percentage of pretty volatile components to it. So if you get hit, no longer is your fuel oil as inert and slow to burn as it typically would be.
And of course, it clogs fuel filters, it fouls fuel pumps. There's a whole lot of issues. It requires a lot of maintenance.
Yes.
So it burns, but it like triples the amount of maintenance you got to do to keep the ships running.
Yeah, right. So you're in a position where you're making some real long-term sacrifices for the sake of fighting this short-term battle. But the Japanese at this point aren't operating on particularly long time horizons anymore.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think they're really concerned about the long-term results. They need immediate results right now. They need to fix this problem.
Yep.
Or it's just going to go even further down the drain. Operation Khan, the Khan operation, was just getting started when Toyota receives word that the Saipan operation that Saipan itself was under heavy naval bombardment. And at that time, he realizes this may actually be the invasion that we were expecting to happen, the big American push in the Central Pacific. And we've talked about this when we did the 3 episodes on Saipan before, is that, they knew they could not lose these islands. They had to throw everything they had, including the kitchen sink, to defend and, if possible, recapture, or at the very least turn away that American invasion fleet. So he assumes correctly that this is the actual landing that he had been expecting. Toyota cancels Operation Khan and issues orders to the combined fleet to execute A Go and prepare for the decisive battle, which now would be fought in the Philippine Sea. So let's talk about the opposing forces. We're not going to get deep into the weeds of Task Force 58. We've done that 1,000 times. But the Japanese here, there's some different people in the arena. And in particular, the Japanese commanding admiral that's going to be in overall command is Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo. What do we know about Jisaburo? I mean, about Ozawa here, John?
Ozawa is one of the brightest admirals in the Japanese fleet. He is seen as a consummate tactician. Honestly, if you go all the way back to the formation of Mobile Fleet in April of 1941, Kido-Butai, the force that raids Pearl Harbor, at the time, there were a lot of people within the Japanese Navy, Yamamoto and Minoru Genda being among them, who really felt that if you're going to put together a combined carrier task force, the guy you want to put in charge of it is Ozawa, because he was seen as an air power advocate and a real forward-looking guy. But because of reasons of naval seniority, Nagumo gets, tapped on the shoulder for that billet rather than Ozawa. Ozawa is a big guy. He's over 6 feet, which for wartime Japan, he's a monster. Not he's referred to by the soldiers, or the sailors, I should say, as the gargoyle, because he was not necessarily the handsomest of individuals. But if you read accounts about him as an officer and a leader, he was pretty exemplary. He was not a yeller. He was seen as someone who really took an interest in his junior officers and would do things like, if he wanted you to obey a regulation, he wouldn't necessarily embarrass you in person on the bridge, but he would just discreetly leave open the rule book precisely to the page of the regulation that he had in mind. And, if you were a bright officer, a bright junior officer, you would like, how did that book get open to that page? And so that was his manner of instruction. He was a very cerebral, interesting dude. And now he's going to get a chance to actually fight his first carrier battle here when the chips are really down.
You got to kind of wonder, and again, what ifs are dangerous, but I mean, what if he had been in charge at Eastern Solomons or Santa Cruz, or
Right. Yeah, you do have to wonder if they might have gotten better results as a result of that. I mean, I think, as we'll discuss here, Ozawa really ends up fighting a pretty intelligent battle here at Phil C. It doesn't do him any good. So
right, he's fighting a beast. So you mentioned it just a minute ago. The Japanese mobile fleet under Ozawa is broken into several what they call forces: A force and B force. A force is centered around the carriers Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. 2 CAs, 1 CL, and 9 destroyers. Now, anybody who's listening is going to go, Taiho, what is that? What was Taiho all about, John?
Taiho is the newest, shiniest carrier in the Japanese inventory, and arguably the finest carrier that they built. Taiho, in some ways, emulates British design tendencies in that she's got a heavily armored flight deck. Even though it's sitting on top of 2 hangar decks, as is the Japanese practice. So she's big, she's fast, she's heavily armored, and she is unsurprisingly also Ozawa's flagship. So this is going to be her first foray into combat. And then the other 2, of course, Shokaku and Zuikaku are, they've been around forever. They are the 2 remaining carriers from Pearl Harbor. And by this time, both of them are extremely proficient at this sort of warfare. B Force, on the other hand, is composed of these 3 very weird animals. You've got the carriers Junyo and Hiyo, which are converted civilian ocean liners. So you got these weird, bulky power plants. Tony and I have this constant debate over these 2 units. I think they're scows. Tony has a warm spot in his heart for them. Anyway, the bottom line with these carriers is they got big enough flight decks so you can put a decent sized air group on them, but because of their power plants, they can't get up to any higher than 25, 26 knots, something like that. They're really not front line, what we would call fleet carriers. And then you got Ryuho, which is another one of these converted seaplane tenders. She's either a seaplane tender or a submarine tender. I can't remember which. the bottom line is that they had a whole series of vessels that they knew they would be able to convert relatively rapidly to light carriers in the event of a war, and Ryuho is one of those. But when she comes out of the yards, they kind of realize that from a structural standpoint, she's extremely suspect. She's just not a very well put together vessel. And so this is going to be one of her few opportunities to get into combat. And then out in front, as I mentioned earlier, we've got this Vanguard force, which is centered on Carrier Division 3, which is got 3 light carriers in it, Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho. Chitose and Chiyoda, again, are converted carriers. Zuiho is as well. Zuiho is actually a very credible little ship. She's the sister ship of Shoho, which was sunk in the Battle of Coral Sea, a very handy, fast little vessel. And again, these 3 light carriers are going to be in charge of doing the scouting operations for the main battle force, getting word back to Ozawa, who then will launch heavy strikes using forces A and B.
So, all told, for those doing the math or trying to do the math, the mobile fleet consists of what you want to say 5 fleet carriers.
I say 5 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers. Yeah, that even though, you know, we sort of look askance at Junyo and Hiyo, I think the Japanese consider them fleet carriers, and we ought to as well. So yeah, 5 and 4, 9 carriers, and about 450 carrier aircraft.
That's a big friggin' force. It's the biggest carrier force that the Japanese have put to sea yet.
Ever.
Like,
Yeah.
by far, it's not even close in terms of numbers of ships, carriers. I mean,
yeah, numbers of ships. That's right. Although, if you look at the total number of aircraft that they brought to Pearl Harbor,
Sure.
you know, this is the first time that they've gotten back to within the Pearl Harbor realm in terms of numbers of aircraft, i.e., over 400. And of course, in this battle, those are going to be backed up by hundreds of land-based aircraft as well, or so they hope. Unfortunately, at this point, you know, they've only got about 300 or so land-based aircraft that are in the Marianas.
and Bill,
Wasn't he counting on something like 1,200 land-based aircraft to take part in this battle?
The figures are all over the place, but yes, they wanted to have more than 1,000 if they could manage that. And unfortunately, again, because of the wrong footing at BIAC, and also because of some of the other things that we're doing at subsidiary airfields like YAP, which we're bombing into the Stone Age as well. The number of aircraft that are eventually going to make it into the Marianas is not nearly what they hoped.
And even when they do get there, they're going to be getting hit pretty hard by Task Force 58 before this battle ever even occurs.
Right.
So Bill, speaking of Task Force 58, we don't need to go into every single ship because we'll be here till Thanksgiving. Yeah. But we laid out the figures for the Japanese mobile fleet. Break down Task Force 58 for us. What are the Japanese going to be heading up against here?
And again, Admiral Spruance is in overall command, but he continues this tendency that he has that Halsey does not, of relegating tactical command to Mark Mitscher when it's a carrier battle. And of course, Halsey considers himself an aviator, so he wouldn't do that. So I guess it's reasonable. But he would then hold or withdraw tactical command back to, pull it back to himself when he believed that a surface battle was going to ensue. So, we talked about it before. 58 was mind-blowing with 7 fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, 7 battleships, 8 heavy cruisers, 13 light cruisers, 68 destroyers, 28 submarines, not in tactical command of Spruance and his forces. They're still under the command of Lockwood, but they're distributed in the area for both screening and interception operations. But the carriers alone could launch over 900 aircraft, Seth.
Yeah. And I was remiss in not summing up then. So the Japanese are bringing, 5 fleet, 4 light fleet, 5 battleships, 7 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and just 31 destroyers. So yeah, any way you slice it, they're only rocking barely half the ships that Task Force 58 is bringing to the party.
And that's why it's so important that land-based formula that AGO has with it. That's why that is so important. It's because Koga knew when he was writing this plan, and Toyota knows too, that they cannot match Task Force 58 plane for plane or carrier for carrier. They cannot do it. They're not
No.
fooling themselves. They know they can't. That's why the land-based airplanes are going to play such an important part in this operation.
But John, even more than the shortfall number of ships, when I was on active duty, we would parse out fuel for aviator training, right? And so we only had so much fuel that we could use for training in any given month. And that shortfall of fuel we talked about before for the Japanese impacted their ability to train, didn't it?
Everything. Yeah, it impacts everything. So yeah, these fleet units are not nearly as well exercised as their American counterparts, and of course the same thing is true in the air. These Japanese pilots do not have nearly the stick time that the Americans do, and they don't have enough gasoline to get that stick time. So yeah, in terms of tactical acumen and combat readiness, the Japanese force is vastly inferior to the American force at this point, just for fuel alone.
Yeah. So the whole you mentioned stick time. I mean, you're talking about Japanese who maybe had a couple of dozen hours of stick time at this point.
They'd probably have more than that. I mean, if you're a carrier aviator, you got to know how to land on a carrier,
Sure.
right? So a lot of these guys, I'm pulling a number out of my hat here. Probably a lot of these dudes have got 200 or 300 hours. Again, they've been rebuilding this carrier force for the better part of 2 years, and they still view these aviators as elite aviators. So they're not, we're not to the end of the war yet in terms of, really using the dregs. But if you take a guy that's got 300 hours of stick time and not that many hours probably in type, and take him up against an American aviator who's got 600 to 800 and multiple hundred hours in a Hellcat or what have you, the disparity again in tactical acumen is going to be distinct.
So all of this, the Japanese plans are based on surprise, and there's a little debate, I guess, we could have as to whether or not Toyota knew or assumed that we knew about their plans, because there's several radio transmissions that go back and forth where the Japanese said, I think they know we're coming. But what do you think about that?
I don't have a definitive answer on that, to be honest with you. I think they're certainly very aware that as soon as they sortie, they're going to get spotted relatively early on. And so the Japanese experience up to this point in the war has been that it's very difficult to get the drop on the Americans from a tactical standpoint. That if nothing else, the Americans are at least going to know that you have forces at sea. That was true even all the way back to the Battle of Midway. There are, a number of entries in the Japanese records that, as soon as some of those forces came out of the Marianas, they have been sighted by submarines. And that same thing, happens here as well. So I feel like both Toyota and Ozawa have to assume that the Americans are at least apprised of the fact that their forces are at sea.
And Toyota is much like, according to Koga's plan, he's throwing a lot of weight, like we talked about, on this land-based air armada.
Right.
That he's counting a lot on, these supposedly 1,200 aircraft that we've already said is not anywhere near that.
Yeah.
These guys are being attrited for several days before the action actually occurs. And the admiral that's in charge of this land-based operation, Admiral Kakuta, he is not a very forthright gentleman.
No, he is not sending good information back to Toyota or anybody regarding just how badly the airfields in the Marianas are taking a beating. And so he is not being forthcoming with an accurate impression of the amount of attrition that his force is already suffering just in the first few days of our pre-invasion preparations. There are, the major airfields within the Marianas are in the south at Guam, in the middle at Rota, and in the north in Saipan, although they did have another subsidiary field at Tinian, which is really close to Saipan as well. All of those airfields are getting hit on a daily basis, and any Japanese aircraft that are coming up are in many cases being shot down.
So, we talked about just a second ago that Ozawa figured that, or not, well, the Japanese period figured that the Americans would know that they're coming, or at the very least, like you said, know that they're at sea.
Yeah.
And on June 13th, as it would have it, both A and B force steam out of Tawi-Tawi, and as predicted, they were sighted by an American submarine, Bill. And I'm going to let you take the reins on this one because, well, subs play a freaking huge part in this battle.
Yes.
Huge part. And it starts right here, Bill. What about the Redfin? Tell us about Redfin.
Yeah, the Redfin was SS-272. He sighted elements of the mobile fleet, attempting to maneuver in for a shot. He by the way, is under the command of Lieutenant Commander Marshall Austin. He's outrun, of course, as submarines often are, by the faster Japanese warships. Try as he might, he could not close the distance for an attack. And while an attack was now out of question, his sighting report was what was really critical here and would be even more valuable. So surfacing later that evening, he sent a contact report that certainly got Spruance's attention. Redfin reported sighting 6 aircraft carriers, 4 battleships, 6 cruisers, and many escorts. It was abundantly clear to Spruance and Mitscher that the Japanese fleet was on the move and they were coming for Task Force 58, Seth.
Yeah.
So Spruance had been aware that the mobile fleet was on the move for the past couple of days, as sighting reports, and this is all building up to this controversial decision that we need to discuss, and we'll get to that in a second. He was aware that sighting reports have been trickling in from submarines, from Filipino coast watchers, guys literally lighting signal fires on the side of mountains, signaling to each other that, hey, there's Japanese ships coming. On June 15th, Spruance receives more reports on the enemy fleet. USS Flying Fish, SS-229, sighted the mobile fleet again, and reported seeing, quote, at least 3 BBs, 3 CVs, and a number of cruisers and destroyers, unquote. Just a little while later, like 4 hours later, and a bit further south, USS Seahorse, under the command of Slade Cutter, SS-304, sighted and reported, quote, several heavy warships, including large BBs. He's reporting Yamato and Masashi at this point. There, at least one would have to assume.
Yeah.
Spruance now, Bill, Spruance is sure that the Japanese, or at least he feels that he's pretty sure that the Japanese intend to do battle here. But at this point, he didn't have the range to scout properly, nor did he have a full intel report. And this is a huge thing. He's getting these reports from these boats. He's getting these reports from these submarines, but he still doesn't have a very clear picture. And that plays a lot into the decision that he's going to make, or in some cases lack thereof. But regardless, set us up, take us through what's going on from here on.
Well, it's a target motion analysis problem. You have a datum, which is a location for the targets, but those targets can change course, right? They're not going to drive forever on a constant course and speed. So the more time goes by, the larger the uncertainty bubble becomes with respect to where these targets actually are. So you have to send out, surveillance planes, reconnaissance planes, and things like that to try to get a more precise location, something where you can vector aircraft, because of course, aircraft don't have an enormous amount of fuel. They need a fairly precise datum, or they're going to fly, miss the target, and have to return. And you waste a bunch of time. And it's worse than just losing the opportunity. You might actually increase the danger to the carriers, having sending the aircraft out, having them miss the target, and having to have them return low fuel. So there's a bunch of issues going on here. So on the morning of the 16th, Kavala sights Ozawa's fleet yet again. Initially, Kavala sights the Japanese tanker fleet. Then later at 19:15 that evening, she sights the jackpot. Her radar picks up many ships, speed 19 knots. So now we have a good datum, a time-critical datum. So speeding to investigate, Lieutenant Commander Herman Kostler cites what he reports as 15 or more large warships. He later says that it was dark as hell, but I could make out the outline of at least one carrier. By now, it was apparent that we were on the track of a large, fast task force heading someplace in a pretty big hurry. On orders to report first and then attack, Kostler sends his report to Subpac at 22:45, and he begins to chase the task force on 4-engine speed, which means obviously he's on the surface, hoping for another chance. He will again indeed get that chance. So I'm going to take a breath here and let you guys jump in before we talk about the attack.
Just remember the name Herman Kostler and USS
Yeah.
Cavallo.
Yeah.
That's all I'm going to say. But we need to take a step back just real quick and look at the intelligence that Spruance is getting here, which even before, because Cavallo's sighting is probably, well, it's not probably, it is the most accurate that he is yet to receive. But he's getting reports from 2 different boats, and then he gets Cavallo's. So he's getting kind of a mixture. He's getting a gumbo, if you will, from South Louisiana of intelligence. And he's sitting there, and this is why this is so important. Like you were saying, Bill, he needs that concrete information to say, okay, they're coming from here, and they're coming with A, B, and C. And he's not gotten that yet because he's gotten 2 different reports from 2 different subs that are from 2 different forces that are coming in 2 different directions. And John, you know this, the Japanese have a history of sending decoy forces or multiple forces and all that. And that's in Spruance's mind. He's thinking about this the whole time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, throughout this war, the Japanese have displayed this predilection for using dispersed formations that oftentimes do not coalesce, that they operate separately as well. And so, he's very concerned that somebody may be trying to lure him in one direction, setting up his landing force for, a hit from another force from another direction. And, the fact that these sighting reports from these submarines are coming from widely separated locations, which is true because there are 2 different main Japanese formations that are going to come together before this battle, but they're coming in from widely dispersed points. And so, the bottom line is,
John,
go ahead.
Spruance knew about the Z plan, right, John? And didn't the Z plan actually call for a feint?
Okay, I'm just going to back off here and say that I have not sat down with the Z plan, and I have not opened that waterlogged briefcase to actually know all of the permutations within that operational plan. If you look at the overall shape of the Japanese battle, though, intriguingly, yes, whereas they are going to be operating in a tactically dispersed fashion, and that you've got the vanguard force and Ko and Otsu forces, they would call them in Japanese, A and B. They're not actually going to come in with a feint. They're bringing all of the dogs to the party, and there's not a subsidiary surface force, for instance, in the way that we will see in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, that's trying to sucker punch Spruance. This is what I would term more of a stand-up fight on the part of the Japanese. They think they can defeat our carrier force in a fair fight, and so they're putting all of their chips into what is essentially a single axis of attack, with all of their carrier forces and really the majority of their heavy battle forces as well. They're all in this one basket.
But we would all agree, though, that Spruance was worried about a feint.
Absolutely. And
Absolutely.
was well within his rights to be so. That's going to inform his decision here.
And that's what I want to get to next, because this is, there were people debating then that he made the wrong decision, and there are people debating now that he made the wrong decision, and there are people debating then that he made the right decision, and the same goes for now. So let's just crack it down. Let's just open this nut and take a look at what's going on. So Spruance's carrier commander, as we said before, was Mark Mitscher. Mark Mitscher was the complete opposite of Raymond Spruance, whereas Raymond Spruance was very calculating, very cautious, very cerebral. Bill, you said one time or multiple times that he's a thinker. He's a heavy thinker. Mark Mitscher is like, if somebody flicks him in the ear, he's going to turn around and jack him right in the face. And he's not unlike William F. Halsey. And they're very, very similar people. And Bill, you pointed that out before we ever even recorded this episode, that they are very, very similar in that respect. And they are. It's very true. Mitscher was aggressive. Some would say he was overly aggressive. He's a fantastic commander, don't get me wrong, but he's very He wants to get this done now. He had received the same reports that Spruance had received, and he desired to head straight at the Japanese with Task Force 58 right now. Let's go hit these guys in the face now. Let's hit them before they ever can even get within range of us, and let's knock them out before they ever come out now. Mitscher felt that if Ozawa maintained his current course and speed, he would be 350 miles from Saipan by dawn. This is interesting, too. By heading straight at the Japanese, Mitscher may get a strike in before dawn, or before dark, rather, but Lee's battleships would be in range to engage. And I say Lee's battleships. This is Willis Ching Lee of USS Washington Kirishima fame. Mitscher radios Lee aboard Washington with the following message, quote, "Do you desire night engagement? It may be we can make air contact later this afternoon and attack tonight," unquote. Ching Lee, who was also an aggressive commander, gives a response that absolutely floored Mitscher, but in retrospect is the right decision. Lee says, quote, "Do not, repeat, not believe we should seek night engagement. Possible advantages of radar more than offset by difficulties of communications and lack of training in fleet tactics at night. Would press pursuit of damaged or fleeing enemy, however, at any time," unquote. This blows Mitscher away, but Lee, again, is making the right call here.
Right. Yeah, on the face of it, it does seem sort of incredible that Willis Lee, who, has a mind of gears and wheels and quadratic equations, would not want to go for that sort of a fight. But I think having survived the fight that he fought in November of 1942, he understands that when you get into a night fight, it's just chaos. And it was hard enough fighting an engagement with just one operational battleship versus the Japanese. What's it going to be like if I take 7 battleships and a bunch of cruisers and destroyers in there in a night engagement that these guys are not necessarily well trained for? It's going to be a nightmare. It's going to be bedlam. And so, he just doesn't want to do it. And so, he does floor Mitscher by saying that. But I think if you look at it coolly and rationally from a tactical standpoint, it's absolutely the right call.
Not 100% the right.
Yeah.
No, it's 100% the right call, because if you go back, so this is June of 1944. If you go back and you look at the operations that the Pacific Fleet had engaged in since February, it had essentially not stopped. And I mean, it stopped here and there, obviously, but I mean, it had not stopped for any kind of really long-term tactical training in terms of surface units. Wherever Task Force 58 went, Willis Lee's battleships were right there. And they did not have the opportunity to do that night training that was necessary to get involved in an operation like this. So while it would be way cool to talk about Willis Lee's battle line just beating the living bejesus out of the Japanese, and they probably would have. Well, Willis Lee knew that it was like,
But if we go back to, the raid on Truk, and
that's true.
The gunnery performance that New Jersey, and was it Wisconsin that was
Iowa
that was involved in trying to shoot up those pathetic Japanese tubs coming out of the north end of Truk. Your gunnery was nothing to write home about. Okay,
it was piss poor.
And the near miss on torpedoes that almost cost Spruance his job, right?
And it's not like the Japanese are going to come to a night fight without some of those destroyers, which are still loaded for bear with long lances. Basically, Lee is saying, I don't want to walk into an area that is probably still a strength area for the Japanese. Why would you do that?
Yeah.
And by his codicil there, would press pursuit of damaged or fleeing enemy at any time. He's like, dude, use air power. And, if you need me to mop up what's left, more than happy to do that. But play to our strong suit, which is air power. So,
no, he makes the right decision. He really does.
Yeah.
What they needed was the modern identity friend or foe that would light up the radar for a blue target, for an American radar target, so you could tell the good guys from the bad. We didn't have that.
We don't
form IFF, and this is trouble.
Yeah,
and of course the aviators think this is just conservative black shoes,
right?
But this is history will prove the Black Shoes correct in this regard.
Yeah.
Much so. So yet another piece of information falls into Spruance's puzzle later that evening on the 18th. Nimitz informed Spruance that a message had been picked up from one of Ozawa's ships, and due to HF direction finding, it placed the sender, that being Ozawa, only about 300 miles from Task Force 58. Mitscher got the same report at 2245. Mitscher, and this is where the whole drama unfolds here. Mitscher radios Spruance at 2325 and requests permission to reverse course and take his carriers towards the Japanese at high speed. Mitscher figured that by doing that, he'd be in position to launch a dawn attack if he could find Ozawa, by the way, and catch the Japanese off guard. The idea of this had every carrier commander in the fleet salivating.
Right. And so it's important to realize that Mitscher as well is being influenced by his individual task group commanders,
Yes.
you know, all of whom likewise, particularly Jocko Clark, are just hyper aggressive. And I've used this analog before, that these dudes really are sort of the nautical equivalent of a Panzer general. I mean, they are extremely technical people. They are all aviators, and they're all just absolutely hyper aggressive, just dripping, you know, with testosterone, and just want to go for these guys. You know, the mental image I've always had of this battle is of Raymond Spruance just holding the leashes of this pack of snarling attack dogs who are just absolutely rigid. Let me go, you know, and just yeah, that's the breed of cat that we've got here.
Yeah, I mean, and Jocko Clark by far is probably the most. He's got a mouth on him, but he's definitely one of the most aggressive. Ray Davison aboard Enterprise is no less. I mean, well, we'll get to this decision in a minute, but he basically has a fit.
This is all based on, again, this conventional wisdom. If there's one thing that's been proved throughout this war, everybody understands that carriers are incredibly vulnerable, dangerous, fragile beasts. And if you're going to win a carrier battle, you must get the first attacks in, you know, to punch the lights out on your enemy. And so, you know, the notion that we would somehow eschew that and stand back on the defensive, it goes absolutely against everything that is baked into the DNA of these dudes at this point in the war.
Yep.
There's an important point to make here, though. That Mitscher's aggressiveness was predicated upon a position that was determined by radio direction finding, RDF, which actually constitutes a huge uncertainty signal.
Yeah.
And Spruance knows that the submarine positions, which differed from the RDF position, was laying eyeballs on target. So there's a very small uncertainty signal. So there's more that goes into Spruance holding back the leashes of those rabid dogs than merely, you know, it's not time.
Right.
There's actually a calculus involved in this as well.
Yeah.
So waiting for what seems like an eternity, and it was a while. Spruance sat there and stewed on this for a while. He finally radios his response back to Mitscher at 0038. It says, and I quote, "Change proposed does not appear advisable. Believe indications given by submarines more accurate than that determined by direction finding. If that is so, continuation as at present seems preferable. End run by other carrier groups remains possibility and must not be overlooked," unquote. It goes back to what we were saying.
Yeah. The danger of a feint. And just from a higher level too, Spruance is, he could give a rip either way about fighting the carrier battle. That's not what he's put here to do. He is the overall commander of this operation, which is designed to capture the Marianas Islands. And, you know, in that sense, he understands that making sure that his amphibious force is well guarded is the sine qua non of this operation. That is absolutely, you know, inarguable. And so, you know, if he can win this battle without fighting a carrier battle, his personal glory means nothing to this guy. Fulfilling the mission is what this guy is all about. And so, you know, the protestations of fire breathers like Jocko Clark have absolutely no meaning in Raymond Spruance's world. They're just immaterial.
Protestations, to be sure, because once Spruance sends that message, Mitscher is like,
Just,
what?
yeah,
What?
are you
Are
kidding me?
you friggin' kidding me?
You are
Guys, like,
intentionally throwing away the initiative in this battle and you are giving it to the enemy. Are you freaking kidding me?
yeah, there was talk. There was talk on these other task group commanders were basically, well, they weren't basically, they were trying to get Mitscher to appeal, to appeal Spruance's decision. And Mitscher, for all his faults, he's like, I don't agree with it, but he's the boss. I'm going to do what the boss tells me to do. And so much so that I forget which carrier task group commander it was, but you can look it up and figure it out. But one guy, basically, it's almost a mutinous conversation. And Mitscher basically smacked him in the mouth. Yeah, shuts his ass down and says, no, we're done. Boss said we're doing this. This is what we're going to do. Right. Whether it's the right decision or not, it's his decision, and we're going to follow orders.
Well, I think too, he knows that, trying to appeal a decision to Mitscher is like arguing with a refrigerator. It's just not going to get you anywhere, right? So what's the point? I'm sorry, Bill.
Yeah, and again, in their defense, I think Arleigh Burke, who was a black shoe, said, we knew we were going to have the hell slug out of us the next morning. We knew we couldn't reach them. We knew they could reach us. I mean, that was one of the concerns they had in waiting here.
Yeah. And the Japanese, and John, I'd like you to comment on this briefly. The Japanese had introduced some new aircraft to their carrier fleet. They still had the Zero, but they particular dive bombers and torpedo aircraft that they had introduced into the fleet. These are new birds. We knew about these things. We knew that they were faster and they had longer range. So to Bill's point, that it was clear to Mitscher that Ozawa is going to stay at arm's length and send his aircraft in here, and we can't get to him.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So by this point in time, the old school Val dive bomber has been phased out and is now being replaced by a new plane called the Judy. There are actually two of these prototypes that were flown at Midway. It's a very high performance, high speed aircraft. Similarly, in the torpedo plane department, the Kate is long gone. And instead, you've got this aircraft called the Tenzan. The Japanese called it. We called it a Jill. Brand new torpedo plane. Again, very high performance. Probably the best, carrier torpedo plane. Well, I guess the TBF people would beat me up if I say that. Jill is a very high speed, good aircraft, though, and it's got very long range. And so, yeah, Ozawa's plan here is to sit at arm's length. And actually what he's going to be doing too is he's going to use what they call shuttle bombing.
Yes.
So I can stay out of range of the Americans. I can launch towards them, and assuming that Mitscher's carriers don't get too far away from the airfields on the Marianas, I'll hit the Americans on the way. I'll bingo over to an airfield at the Marianas. I will refuel and rearm there. I will take off then again, hit the Americans on the way back to my carrier. So they should be able to hit us coming and going if this all goes according to plan. And Ozawa will be able to stay out of tactical range of the Americans. So that's all part and parcel of what the Japanese want to do. And the Americans are aware of the performance characteristics of their aircraft, and they understand that, if we have deliberately ceded the initiative and we are now going to have to stand on the defensive, it's very unlikely that we're going to be able to reach out and touch the Japanese in return.
To the point that the aircraft carriers, the American aircraft carriers, the flight decks are spotted to that very purpose. The dive bombers, for the most part, the TBFs, for the most part, are put down in the hangar decks. The F6Fs are brought topside. They're fueled. They're ready to go, because Mitscher knows that tomorrow's fight, June 19th, it's going to be a fighter fight. We're going to have to defend all damn day.
Right.
And maybe get a launch.
So not the position you want to be in. Yeah.
All right. So Mitscher launches scouts all night long. As we said, he's aware that this is going to be a defensive fight, that this fight coming up on the 19th is a defensive fight. It's going to be a defensive fight all friggin' day. He launches scouts all night long. Radar-equipped scouts from Enterprise prowled the night, but found nothing. In fact, the only Americans to, quote, see anything on the ocean surface were the radar-equipped PBM Mariners. And it's something we forgot to mention. We said that Spruance wanted some more eyes out there, and he knew that the carrier didn't have that kind of range. So he he says, get your ass down here. PBM Mariners from Inuiatak. These are these long-range flying boats to go out there and search for these guys. They actually see something on their radar screens, but it's 380 miles from Task Force 58, which is too damn far for anything in the American carrier fleet to reach out there and touch these guys. Just like Mitscher had initially figured, Ozawa would indeed want to fight the Big Blue Fleet at arm's length. Not surprisingly, Ozawa also has his scouts out for this exact same reason. He had launched some from his carriers, but was relying on those flying from Guam specifically to find Task Force 58. And lo and behold, at 0550, one of these scouts indeed does find Task Force 58. Fully aware of Task Force 58's position, Guam begins launching aircraft in accordance with the AGO plan. And this is one of the very first furballs of Turkey Shoot Day here. And the first aerial fight of the day goes pretty much like the rest of the day is going to go here. Aircraft from Bunker Hill CV-17 are vectored along with aircraft from Bella Wood CVL-24, and they're soon augmented by Hellcats from Yorktown CV-10, Hornet CV-12, and Cabot CVL-28. So this is in the span of about an hour. 6 full squadrons of Hellcats are vectored to this threat that is popping up on American radar over Guam.
As I remarked in the notes, I think this is an aspect of the battle that is not properly appreciated, that not only are we on the defensive and know that we're going to have to defend, 15 carriers, which is not an insubstantial amount of flight decks to protect, but TF-58 has the power to suppress all the Japanese air activity on multiple different islands and do it simultaneously. That's just unearthly when you think about it. Nobody could do that up until this point in the war. If you look again at the Japanese carrier force, yes, they did something like this on the morning of December 7th. If you look at the breakup of their air activities, more than half of their aircraft are devoted to air supremacy and shutting down the airfields on Oahu. But they could only do it for about 2 hours, and then the attack is over with and home they go. There's never been a carrier force that has the ability to not only fight a full-blown carrier battle, but also shut down airfields which are hundreds of miles apart. Yeah. It's crazy when you think about it. Just the amount of air power they bring to this fight.
And that's the key. Go ahead, Bill.
You're talking about Guam, Saipan, Tini, and Rota, plus keeping combat air patrol up, and so for reactive defense,
right,
in all the course of days.
Yeah. And a lot of that is driven by the fact that, the mixture of aircraft on these carriers, American carriers, has now been heavily skewed towards fighters. Everybody understands that you need fighters for everything, right? And so the attack wings on these carriers are now a lot smaller than they used to be. But, again, just again, from an orchestration standpoint, too, being able to marshal squadrons of Hellcats from multiple different carriers and get them over to the targets, on the needed time. It's really a testament.
And that's what I wanted to point out, is that the fighter director operations, the FDOs of all the carriers, but there's one main FDO in this, he's aboard Lexington, that's basically orchestrating the majority of these fighter vectors, regardless of this. You remember when we talked about Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz, we had Cap in the sky to go meet the Japanese, but in one way, shape, or form, they were sent in the wrong direction, or they couldn't find them, or they never could get a hold of these guys. That is not the case here. Within the span of an hour, what did I say? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Hellcat squadrons from 5 different aircraft carriers are launched and sent to intercept this, or interdict, not intercept, but interdict this force over Guam. And in the span of an hour, over 30 Japanese aircraft are shot down with a loss of 1 Hellcat. I mean, that's operations on an unprecedented level.
Right.
Yeah, John, you mentioned Combat Information Center earlier, CIC. And as we know, Nimitz took a personal interest in the development of this capability on the ships. Are we seeing Nimitz's fingerprints with his FDO improvement here?
I'd say yes.
I'd say yes, just because Nimitz was, such a freak when it came to training. I mean, training was the byword. Training and frankly, intelligent organization. That's the other thing that's going on here too, is that it's not just that you've got good people in these CICs, it's that there are now, clear lines of command drawn all through this force. Everybody knows who's doing what and wherever, So the organizational aspect of this, I think, is pretty unprecedented too. This is a gigantic machine. You got 15 different aircraft carriers, but they're all operating as a cohesive whole, even though they are in completely separate task groups as well.
Yeah.
It's
mind-boggling.
It's mind-boggling.
It really is. So, and this is important. And we mentioned this just a few minutes ago, that we said Admiral Kakuta, who is the Japanese admiral in charge of the land-based aerial operation, is a less than forthright gentleman. Yeah. He's not exactly the most honest. He's not Honest Abe here. As the fight is ongoing above him, and this goes on throughout the day, this is not a one-time occurrence, he relays a message that says, we're doing good. We're putting a hurting on Task Force 58, when he knows damn well that his people are getting hammered.
Yeah.
And that factors a lot into what Ozawa is going to do and what he believes to be happening, because he's taking this man at his word.
Yeah. And I don't have an explanation for that, other than to say that Japanese in general do not like being the bearers of bad news. And Kakuta, if he thinks that his bad news might end up aborting this carrier battle, when Ozawa might still have the opportunity to do some good here against the Americans, I could see him getting into a frame of mind where, okay, yeah, it's kind of bad, but, I'm not going to be Debbie Downer here and, subtract from Ozawa's morale, get in there, rah, rah, we're doing our bit, we're fighting furiously, if impotently.
We're executing the plan.
Yeah, we're executing the plan. That's right. That's a great point, actually. There's a fair amount of plan inertia going on here at this point. We know our forces are at sea. We know they're going to attack this morning. Am I doing anybody any good by telling them that actually we're getting shellacked here this morning? I could see him, for cultural reasons, just kind of saying, I'm just going to kind of shut up about that for the time being. But yeah, it sure doesn't do any favors for Ozawa.
Once Ozawa gets the location for Task Force 58, he immediately begins to launch, like you had said, John, from the was it B Force, or not B Force, the Van Force with Chitose and Chiyoda and all these earlier, these smaller aircraft carriers. Bill, at 0950, these aircraft come into range of USS Alabama, which is only 2 hours from my house, BB-60. Her radar lights up with bogeys inbound. Take us through what's going to happen after this.
Yeah, it was more than 50 bogeys at a distance about 120 miles, bearing 265. True, that's west. The dope, as they say, was as good as this was. This was called Raid 1. So 69 Japanese aircraft launched from Chiyoda, Chitose, and Zuiho. Say the last one.
Yep, good job.
All right, we're headed for Task Force 58. Less than 5 minutes later, other radar screens in Task Force 58 showed the same target. And from USS Lexington, Mitscher's flagship, came the preconceived rally call "Hey, Rube," that radio message sent in the clear to all Hellcats aloft was meant to tell the Hellcat drivers to convene over the task force and repel an air attack. So again, the call was, "Hey, Rube," and I can actually show a little map here to show you exactly how this was evolving. So Raid 1 is coming right here
Yeah,
from the ships,
from the
and then
bank.
the intercept point was right almost all the way to the carriers. And so there's Intercept 1 and Intercept 2. We'll talk about these as we evolve. But that's kind of where we are at this point with the raid inbound and the Hellcats being sent up to intercept, Seth.
Yeah, and there's these 5 squadrons, and some of them, admittedly, some have landed back aboard their carriers, but there's still a great group of Hellcats in the air. And then GQ sounds on the carriers, and Alex Rashu, who we've talked about before, who's a friend of mine, said, and this is his big day, by the way, he said that when GQ went off, everybody ran to the flight deck, and there was no "I'm going to get in my airplane" or none of this. You just jumped in what you had. He said, quote, "There was none of that "I'm flying my airplane" stuff. It was, if it was running, you jumped in and you went. It was basically like a cattle stampede. And John, you wanted to talk about the CAP envelope, and the CAP envelope for Combat Air Patrol. Let's be, so people don't understand what CAP is. Combat Air Patrol envelope for the United States Navy was much different than it had been. It had expanded much further than it had in 1942.
That's right. I mean, if you look at a lot of the carrier battles in 1942, you're finding intercepts are happening 25 miles away from the carrier, 30 miles. We've gotten this initial radar report of inbound bogies at 120 miles, and this CAP that we have now in the middle of 1944 is capable of making interceptions at 60 miles, 80 miles, maybe 100 miles. So that means, of course, that from a Japanese perspective, you have just that much longer, now double distance in many cases, that you're going to have to fight through this gauntlet of combat air patrol fighters coming at you before you even get within tactical range of the American ships.
Mm-hmm. And in our conversations before we recorded this episode over the past late last week, we said that this was a Godzilla-esque force that the Japanese were coming against in the form of Task Force 58, and they had no earthly idea the kind of buzzsaw they were going to run into.
Yeah. Again, because of halftime in the carrier war, when the Americans come out of halftime, just there really are occasions when the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. I mean, a lot of people look at this battle and they say, well, the Hellcat's a better fighter than the Zero, or, the pilots were better than the Japanese pilots. Yes. And, at some point, if you put together enough components that are significantly better than your opponent's components, and they are intelligently organized and smoothly led, all of a sudden you have this emergent beastie, that is just head and shoulders better than what you had 2 years ago. And that's exactly the case here.
Yep. Bill, tell us about some of these first intercepts. June 19th was an absolutely perfect day for fighter operations. There's images, and I'll show some of these in this video, that there was the aircraft, the sky was, crystal clear. It was like ceiling unlimited, visibility unrestricted. Yeah, it was perfect.
Ceiling and visibility unlimited, KU, yeah.
Yeah, it was perfect.
These aircraft, the intercept took place so far away from the carriers that it took the Hellcats 30 minutes to reach them.
Yeah.
And the Essex Hellcats from VF-15 easily found their prey in the clear skies, led by Commander Charles Brewer, who had been CAG. The Essex Hellcats tore into the Japanese. In a matter of minutes, the fighting aces of VF-15 decimated the Japanese inbound strike, with Brewer and his wingmen each claiming 4 kills apiece. Unfortunately, Brewer would be lost later in the day over Guam in what would be his 4th flight of the afternoon. Another fighting ace, George Carr, trailed behind Brewer. In one pass, Carr nails 2 Jills before the Japanese escort got on his tail. Diving away, Carr easily pulled away from the escorting Zero. Pulling up, he closed in on another Zero coming at him head on, blowing the Zero away from a range of less than 50 yards. Quickly seeing two more Zeros, Carr slid behind them and set both afire, claiming his 5th kill in less than 5 minutes. Circling around to check the sky, Carr notes parachutes all around him, flaming debris dotting the ocean below. He stopped counting at 17 parachutes. He wasn't far off the mark. It turns out the Fighting Aces had dropped 20 aircraft in a span of 8 minutes. This is just remarkable, guys.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately for the Japanese, a lot of those guys in those parachutes, they're not going to be recovered. So, yeah, these are irrecoverable losses for them.
No, and what's the really bad part for the Japanese is this is going to occur over and over and over and over again all day long. Over the next 30 minutes, other squadrons piled in on the Japanese of Raid 1. Bunker Hill again, Hornet, Cowpens, and Cabot's Hellcats all tore into Raid 1. One of the last groups to eat up the Japanese was Princeton, and John, Princeton is one of your favorite ships. VF-27. You've seen pictures of her Hellcats before. They had shark mouths on them, a la P-40s of the Flying Tigers, which is just cool.
Why wouldn't you? I mean, come
exactly.
on. Right.
Exactly. At 14,000 feet, Princeton's Hellcats eat up the Japanese. Literally, they ravage the Japanese Jills and Judys, the escorting Zeros. And this is intriguing to me. And this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, the lack of experience, the lack of training for the Japanese. You can't tell me they didn't see these guys.
Right.
The Japanese not combat air patrol, but the escorting Zeros paid no mind to the Hellcats down there kicking that ass all day long. They ignored them.
Inexplicable. Yeah.
Yeah.
Didn't know what to do. Didn't
want to die.
Yeah. Which seems very odd. Yeah. No, I can't explain it. Can't explain it.
What remains of Raid 1, which admittedly is not a whole heck of a lot, blunders into Willis Lee's battle line, which is the last place on the planet Earth these guys wanted to be. Right at the middle of the task force is USS Indiana. She is coordinating all this anti-aircraft
badness.
Badness. And no surprise here, when the Japanese come over Willis Lee's battle line, these battle wagons just erupt in absolute furious gunfire, something the likes of which these Japanese had never seen before in their lives.
Yeah. Well, and at this point, of course, we've got VT fusing on the 5-inch guns, which is increasing the lethality of that particular weapon by a factor of between 5 and 7, depending on the literature you want to read. All of those battleships are absolutely chock-a-block with 40 millimeter Bofors and Oerlikons as well. So the sheer throw weight that these ships can put up there is it's just absolutely unearthly. And so flying through that is flying through the nautical equivalent of a buzzsaw, and they just get it erased essentially.
It's important to note, and we just kind of breezed around this earlier, is that Willis Lee's battle line, the fast battleships are put where they are in the formation to do this very thing.
Put them out in front of the carriers.
Yeah, once he figures out where the Japanese are more than likely going to be coming from, Mitscher sends the battle wagons out there, and they form up into their own little separate task. I forget, what is it, Task Force 64? Regardless, they form up into their own little task group within the task force with the sole purpose of just being anti-aircraft defense, and they're going to be bait. I mean, a battleship is an enticing target.
Absolutely. The thing is, though, that from a tactical standpoint, they are an extremely difficult target to actually do anything to. Sure. I mean, if you're a dive bomber, you haven't got a weapon that'll go through the armor of a battleship at all. You might cause some superficial damage to some of the anti-aircraft guns or the superstructure, but it's a big juicy target that really isn't going to return that much in the way of results, even if you do hit it, and they don't even end up hitting it because the gunpowder that they walk into is so ferocious that they just can't get through.
It's nasty. Bunker Hill and San Jacinto Hellcats pick up the scraps of Raid 1, and by 10:52, the raid is over. Some 42 Japanese aircraft from the original 69 launched had been shot down. 13 Japanese aircraft had mechanicals or battle damage and never returned to the fleet after the fight. It was an absolute slaughter. Yet, as bad as that was, it wasn't even the worst one yet.
We're just getting going. Yeah.
Indeed.
Mhm.
Indeed. And the big boys are coming now.
Right.
So Ozawa's second strike, known to history as Raid 2, had been launched from the fleet carriers Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, and included some 27 Jills, 53 Judys, each of which were armed with a 1,000-pound bomb, and some 48 escort fighters, all bound for Task Force 58. Bill, take us through what goes on after they are launched here from Lexington's point of view.
Yeah, going back to the map here, interestingly, Raid 2 takes almost the same track as Raid 1, which is not a smart thing to do, right? So, because obviously the Americans are already attuned to the threat vector. And so Lexington radar again picks up the strike at 11:07. Aborts and mishaps had reduced the inbound Japanese strike to 109 aircraft, not as large as before, but still a formidable number.
Yeah, it's a
And
big
indeed,
strike.
by 1942 standards, as John, as you like to point out, this is still a massive raid, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, this is as big as the morning attack that went after the island of Midway. You know, it's exactly the same size. If this force can, get an enemy task force into its sights in any sort of a cohesive fashion, you got the whole shooting match here. You got dive bombers and torpedo planes and the whole thing. This is a big, dangerous attack.
This is a killing force if they can get within range.
It is, absolutely. But as they get within range, the Raid 2, just like Raid 1 before it, wastes precious time orbiting outside the fleet to try to coordinate, form up. I'm not sure what the heck's going on here. Presumably, they're organizing their strike. But the Japanese are really only setting themselves up on the dinner table for the Hellcats, right?
Right.
Another illustration that they didn't really understand the nature of our radar-driven defenses. I mean, can you think of any other reason they would do this, John?
No, it makes no sense to me because, and I really should have picked Tony's brain a little more concisely on this, but frankly, if you launch and form up off of your carriers, this is the formation you're going to go into your attack with anyway.
Right.
And so any notion that you're going to, take a halftime out here and let's reform up, guys, that says that your pilots are not well enough trained to maintain their formation during the transit to the target, which again, is a ding on the relative levels of expertise within these two carrier forces.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say is they had to come apart as they were flying through. That's my only thought.
Yeah. There's no time to huddle up. To call the play.
And they just don't understand the distance at which we're actually making these initial detections. That their own sets aren't going to get detections at that range, and so the notion that the Americans might be engaging us 50, 60, 70 miles away from the attack probably doesn't even enter their consciousness until it does.
Yeah.
Boy, does it.
And your friend Alex Bracey is involved in this, isn't he, Seth?
He was. Yeah, this was, as I said, this is his big day. This is his biggest day of the war. He had run topside, like I said, when GQ sounded on Lexington. And those who are listening will say, wait a minute, I thought he was on Intrepid. He was at one point on Intrepid. After Intrepid gets hit with the torpedo, he requests for and receives a transfer to VF-16. So because he was a flying fool, he wanted to get in the air. When he hears GQ, he jumps in the first Hellcat he sees, and he says, and I quote, "Nobody kicked the tires. We jumped in and away we went. Kind of wish I'd kicked the tires on my bird, though." You're going to see why here in a minute. When he jumped in the Hellcat, he jumped into a bird with a rough engine, although it didn't show at that time. Once airborne, he got a vector from Lexington's FDO, quote, "Vector 250, climb to Angels 25, pronto," is what it said. Pushing his throttle forward in the climb, the Hellcat's engine at that point begins to cough and sputter. Every time he pushed the big Pratt & Whitney into high blower, it would spew oil all over his windscreen and want to die. And he was like, well, this is probably not a good thing to do here. As his squadron is just peeling away because they're going at full speed, he can't keep up. the squadron is leaving him behind, as I put in the notes, PDQ, which of course stands for pretty damn quick. Before long, they're out of sight, and he's nursing a sick bird out of the fight. He said, and I quote, "I was pretty disappointed. I felt like I wasn't going to get a piece of this action, and I was sick about it," unquote. However, as we all probably do know, Alex Vrashew indeed will get a shot at the Japanese. There was another very famous aviator aloft that morning at this very same time. This guy's name is David McCampbell from VF-15. David McCampbell takes his squadron and heads straight into the Japanese formation. McCampbell picks out a formation of Judies and took 6 of his flyers with him, making slashing high side runs in the hapless formation. McCampbell dropped 5 aircraft despite having repeated weapons issues. McCampbell was probably, next to Vrashew, probably the deadest eye in the entire fleet. As he empties his magazines, and I never knew David McCampbell, but I read some of his oral histories from the Nimitz Museum. As he empties his magazines, he drew to within range of Chang Li's battleships. He said, "I kept a healthy distance from those battleships." When he started seeing those flak puffs pop up in the sky above him, he's like, "Not today, Jack." And he turned around and left the scene. The remainder of his flying aces dropped an additional 13 aircraft. VF-15 departed. An additional 43 Hellcats piled into the furball and cut the Japanese to pieces. Alex Vrashew. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, speaking of the battle line, I had to do just a little real-time history here and take a look at my presentation. Willis Lee's battle line is technically Task Group 58.7. Just so we got that out of the record, okay?
Had to be 50 point something.
That's right. Pray continue.
Thank you. 64 was the one at Guadalcanal.
Correct. Yeah.
That's what it was.
Its own separate animal.
Anyway, that's what it was. That's what it was. So, still nursing his sick Hellcat, Alex Vrashew's aloft. He's orbiting the task force right now. He doesn't have the speed or the power to get to the rest of his squadron. He starts picking up other stragglers who are flying other sick Hellcats. These guys aren't going to land because they know that this is going to be a big day for them. Alex gets on the horn and he calls Lex's FDO for another vector. And he says, quote, "The FDO vectored me to 265 bogeys 75 miles away. I don't know why, but there was something in his voice that made it sound like if this was a good vector, I was hoping for the best," unquote. He does. Reaching the point of interception, I remember him telling me, he says, "I got there and I looked around and I saw 3 aircraft." And I was like, well, this is not what I wanted to.
Isn't juicy?
No, this 3's fine, but this is not what I expected to find. He starts peering around. He looks, he sees a gaggle of about 50 aircraft inbound 2,000 feet below him, which is the best spot to be if you're a fighter pilot, and closing. Less than 40 miles away, the bogeys, now bandits, are heading straight for the outer edge of Task Force 58. Vrashew, and for those who haven't heard us talk about him before, I'm going to give you a brief history. This guy was a badass. I mean, there's no other way to frame it. He was just a bad dude. He was born to be a fighter pilot. He had trained, rather, let me rephrase that. He was initially in VF-6. That was his first squadron. Butch O'Hare at that time was CEO of VF-6. Butch O'Hare realized that Alex Vrashew, he saw some potential in this young man. And that's exactly what he did. Yeah. That's exactly what he did, because he saw potential in Alex Vrashew. And at this time, it's also clear, we should note that Alex was the Navy's top gun right now. He had 12 fighters to his credit, or 12 enemy aircraft to his credit. He was the Navy's top fighter ace. So he slides down and underneath the formation to basically get a judge of how things are looking.
Which is weird to me, because if you have a 2,000-foot height advantage, why the hell didn't you use it? Did he ever give you an explanation? Energy. Yeah, it's all about energy tactics, baby. I don't get that. Anyway,
he never gave me a clear indication as to why he did that, but what he does makes sense after this. He gets up underneath the Japanese, basically takes account at everything he sees and amplifies his report to the FDO aboard Lex and says, "Hey, there's exactly this many Jills, there's exactly this many Judys," or whatever the case may be. "Here's my course, here's my heading, here's their speed, here's where they're coming. You might want to get some people out here because there's 50 aircraft here and I'm
Right.
one dude.
Right.
He pushes low for more speed. Or rather, let me rephrase it. He gets on one Judy and he blows this thing out of the air with a short burst. He pushes low to gain more speed, circles back, flames 2 more in seconds on his second pass. His passes, as he passes along, it causes the Japanese to basically just and scatter because these guys, yeah, it's like kicking over an anthill. Yeah, scramble, kicking over an anthill. He gets on another Judy that quite simply explodes right in front of his face. He puts rounds at the wing root. His 650s blow the wing off, and the thing just tumbles over and goes out of the way. It's his 4th kill in less than 5 minutes. By now, the Japanese had reached Task Force 58's AAA umbrella. So, I mean, this fight is devolving very quickly.
Fairly close in, yeah.
Very close, and he pays no mind. You know, we always said that once enemy fighters would get into range of American AAA, usually American fighter pilots would be like, "All right, let's let the AAA do their thing." Yeah,
yep.
He did not do this. He chases this guy in here. He chases another Judy into the flak sky, drops his 5th Judy. He pulls him behind another, squeezing the trigger on his stick. And I remember he told me this. He said this thing just blew up. He says, I must have hit his bomb. He said, I'd seen aircraft explode, but nothing like this. Flies right through the debris, a lot of it which hits the wing root and the nacelle of the Hellcat. The final Judy in this formation that he attacks is knocked out by American AAA. He pulls back on his stick, and so help me God, I remember him saying this like it was yesterday. He says, quote, I could see the sky was filled with parachutes and planes on fire and the water. I swear to God, I put my hand on my heart and said, quote, that's my payback for Pearl Harbor, unquote. I remember him saying that like it was yesterday. And I mean, that's got to feel pretty damn good. You know, I mean, your job is to destroy the enemy, and you not only did you destroy them, you destroyed 6 in a span of less than 5 minutes. What was even more remarkable, when he lands his aircraft back aboard Lexington, Alex had only used 360 rounds from his magazines to shoot down 6 enemy aircraft. That's some sharp shooting.
Yeah, that's crazy. That also speaks to the extremely close range that he was. And that's a characteristic of a lot of the really good aces. I mean, Bong was the same kind of guy. I mean, yes, he could do really good deflection shooting, but you know, if he could, he would get up within 50 yards of them and just murder them with a few rounds. It was just much more efficient to do it that way. If you had, you know, the sort of personality that didn't mind getting within 50 yards of an enemy fighter.
And he certainly had that personality. When he lands back aboard Lex, as soon as he lands, he's taxiing his Hellcat forward, which, by the way, aside from the dents that it had taken from the debris, was completely undamaged. As he's rolling forward, he spies Mitscher standing on the flag bridge of Lexington, and he flashes 6 fingers, which, of course, there's a very famous picture of that. And I'll show it here. It's probably one of the most famous photographs of the entire war, frankly. Mitscher comes down to the flight deck and asks to have a picture taken. The same guy that took the picture of Alex flashing the 6 fingers, Mitscher asked to have a picture taken with Alex shaking his hand. And there's several versions of this image. And Mitscher apparently says, that one's for me. He says, I want to remember this. And that, which is just freaking cool. I mean, when the boss says, you did a good job, son.
Yeah, that's a big thumbs up there. Yeah, for sure. Well, you know, some of that speaks to the fact, of course, that Mitscher would be well aware that Alex is the leading ace in the Navy at this point. So, of course, he's going to come down and shake his hand. But, yeah, he was also kind of a man of the people. I mean, he was an aviator himself, and he wanted to keep the morale high. So, yeah, absolutely. Take that photo op.
So Vrashu rings his kill total up to 18 in this one mission. He goes from 12 to 18 in one flight. And he is, at this point, as I said, Navy's top gun. Raid 2, as much of a slaughter as Raid 1 was, Raid 2 is even worse. 97 of the attacking 109 aircraft had been shot down.
That's unprecedented. You can find kamikaze missions that weren't that bad in terms of, you know, the escorting fighters that went along with them and that kind of stuff. And just holy Magilla. Yeah. It's crazy.
I mean, it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. So the Japanese are not done. They launched 2 more raids, what we call raid 3 and 4. They hit Task Force 58 later on in the day. The third strike, as I said, known as raid 3, was hardly a raid at all.
And if I could show you the tracks here, I mean, it's not like they head out on the wrong vector, but they do correct, right? If you want to say, look, I'm afraid because of what happened the first 2, I'll just continue on the vector I was sent, and then just
go over the sideband.
Yeah, we never found them. And then raid 4 all the way down here, and again, but they correct too. So again, both of them sent out on the wrong vectors. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah. The third Japanese strike's got 47 aircraft in it. It was intercepted by 40 Hellcats 50 miles away. 7 enemy aircraft are shot down, and the rest broke for home pretty quick. Some got close to Enterprise, but nobody really takes too much of a shot at the American carriers because they just don't get that damn close. Raid 4 was given the wrong coordinates, as we said. Bill, you said they corrected. They could not really find Task Force 58 and instead go to Guam and Rota to refuel, where they were set upon by the Hellcats again. Losing 9 in short order, the rest fled to Orote over Guam, where they were hit hard by 27 Hellcats from various squadrons. Basically, who's ever in the air, as they tried to land. 30 of the 49 Japanese are shot down in this raid too. It's unbelievable. Absolutely. It's just a beating.
It's a mincing machine. And again, the fact that we're able to keep, suppression assets over these airfields to beat up any of the survivors that make it through the gauntlet. And, you think you're getting to your home airbase, and what do you see as soon as you go into the landing pattern? You've got Hellcats coming at you.
Hellcats.
Merry Christmas. Just really not a good day at the ranch.
Yeah, our airplanes aren't blue. Why are these guys here?
Yeah,
really.
It's a bad feeling.
All right. So as much of a beatdown as the American fighter pilots had thrown on the Japanese all day long, and we'll give the final numbers here in a minute, there's people are going to be listening to that. You left this big part out. No, we didn't. We were just saving the meat so Bill could put the meat on the table. Bill, the subs, I mean, arguably play probably the most vital role in the operation as it unfolds over the next 2 days. Lay it on us, man.
Well,
what are these boats doing?
From the destruction of the Japanese fleet standpoint, I think that's true, right? Because what we've had to this point is the Turkey Shoot, shooting down a bunch of Japanese airplanes, which was important. And remember, throughout the war, the primary submarine target was merchant shipping. We're trying to starve the Japanese. There were a few opportunities the submarines had to go against warships, and this day was going to be really important because, unbeknownst to the Japanese, their launches were being watched earlier that morning. We're going to talk about USS Albacore, SS-218, which had sighted Ozawa around 0815. Lieutenant Commander Blanchard in Albacore had been trying to catch up with Zuiho Group for some time, but had not been able to close range. He was frustrated. He was about to go deep when, lo and behold, another carrier air group shows up and quite literally sails directly in front of him. The angle and bow to this carrier was 10 degrees. So that's basically pointing right at you. 10 to starboard 10 degrees. Blanchard closes to a distance of 9,000 yards. Remember, you've got torpedo run you got to worry about, and the target's closing you, which you got to worry about. So the intercept point has to be, managed. Otherwise, this relative motion problem closes too quickly, and you're going to lose control of the entire approach. Target track was about 2,300 yards when a destroyer passed in front of him, forcing him to lower his scope, which is not unusual. It's not a big deal. You've got the target relative motion and the target data computed, the TDC, and you're going to be able to shoot with the scope up or down. But you would like that final bearing before you shoot. You pickle that thing off before you shoot. At 0804, Albacore is 5,300 yards from the carrier, 1,950 yards from the target track. This is setting up to be an ideal approach. As he's feeding the target information to the TDC freezes and dies. It's Murphy's Law. This happens. But you know what? We trained for this. We trained to do mental approach and attack. Even when I was in prospective commanding officer school, we were training to do this mental approach calculation so you could shoot even without the computer. And with the carrier rapidly drawing away, Blanchard chose to fire somewhat blind and hope for the best, taking the bearings, using a scope. He manually updates the TDC and then fires all 6 bow tubes, then took his boat deep because he knows what's about to happen. The torpedo tracks pointed straight at albacore. Remember, there's a big arrow pointing submarine here.
6 of them.
Torpedoes.
Yeah, right here.
So he suffers, and he does suffer through a significant depth charging. Not hearing any detonations of the torpedo with his first 5 fish, he worries my mental analysis on that approach failed. He thought he'd miss, but between depth charges, he does hear one explosion that sounds like a torpedo. Fingers crossed, right? And indeed it was. The carrier Blanchard had fired upon was none other than that remarkable aircraft carrier that John regaled earlier in this episode, the Taiho, Ozawa's flagship. The one torpedo that did hit her slammed into her starboard side and flooded the forward elevator well. The explosion didn't do much physical damage to Taiho, but it does rupture avgas lines. You're going to remember this from very early in the war happening to us. Yeah. It spilled fuel into her and allowed the fuel vapors to begin spreading throughout the ship. The hit that initially appeared minor would prove to be significantly more than that. Yeah. John, can you talk about Taiho's demise?
Yeah, basically what ends up happening is when the torpedo hits, it's forceful enough to drop the forward elevator in its well, and it also cracks the cofferdam in the forward avgas storage supply. And so, yeah, you've got vapors now sort of seeping through the forward half of the ship. And since the Taiho was in the middle of launching a raid at this point, the damage control crew very quickly puts a patch over the elevator so that they can continue doing flight operations. And they'll just leave the elevator down in its well, and we'll deal with that later. So the raid goes off, and they realize that they've got fumes spreading through the forward end of the ship. So what they end up doing is trying to ventilate the ship by turning the fans on throughout the ship to hopefully eject those vapors. What it ends up doing, unfortunately, is it just ends up drawing those vapors throughout the entirety of the ship. And much like the Lexington, then about 6 hours later, it is quite a span of time, 6 hours, there's a stray spark. It detonates the gasoline vapor, and an enormous explosion occurs on board the ship that ends up actually buckling the armored flight deck on this thing, which I think is about 4 inches thick. So it's quite a big kaboom. Blows the sides out of the vessel as well. And the result is that, she's going down. Ozawa transfers his flag to a heavy cruiser, and Taiho ends up sinking at 16:28 and taking down about 650 guys with her.
Yeah,
cream of the crop is gone on the Japanese side, and
first and only fight. Yeah.
Yeah. So that is not the only submarine kill of this June 19th. Remember when I said, remember Herman Kostler? Bill, tell us about Kostler and Kavala.
And I'd got to say, just as an outsider, having not done any of the submarine episodes before, when you queue up Bill for these things, you can just see the saliva coming down.
That's why we saved it. That's why we
give us Kostler.
I probably shot 100 torpedoes in my career, none of them in anger, of course, right? So, yeah, and some without the computer, just like as happened here with Albacore. But on the Kavala, we'd seen Japanese carriers on the 15th, but he'd been unable to attack. He'd also been tracking Japanese flat tops on the 19th. So around noon, Kavala had been able to maneuver into an attacking position, raising a scope so he could clearly see a carrier that turned out to be Shokaku looming on the horizon. The Shokaku was quite famous. Of course, you're not sure which carrier this is, but from a point-blank range of 1,200 yards, Kavala fires all 6 of her bow tubes. 3 of the fish slam into Shokaku on her starboard side.
Actually,
Japanese
yeah.
sources are conflicting,
Yes.
but you have some information on this, John, don't you?
Yeah, actually, Tony and I wrote a pretty lengthy analysis of this attack. We too played all sorts of interesting games, saying, okay, what happens if it's the first fish that hits? What happens if it's the second? And basically running Shokaku back and forth across all of the various attack vectors. We're pretty sure that she actually got hit by 4 torpedoes, 2 forward, 1 pretty close to the abgas, and 1 that actually would have probably plowed into the bulkhead between her number 3 and number 5 engine room. So the result of that is just devastating. I mean, she loses power like right now. And there are, heavy fires already happening. And because of the 2 hits forward, she gets a pretty pronounced downward trim. Yeah. So she just, she slobbers out of line and comes to a halt. They're fighting her fires for quite a while, but, those efforts are unavailing. And it's pretty clear by about 13:30 that she is going to go down. And so, the word goes out, we're going to abandon ship. All the survivors are to gather on the flight deck aft, and we're going to, do a head count, take down the flag, and get off of this ship. Well, they thought that they had more time than they ended up having, because what ends up happening, unfortunately, is there's an enormous explosion in the front of the ship. Her forecastle was already down at water level. When this explosion goes off, she begins to sink very rapidly. Her flight deck goes under, and when the water gets to her forward elevator well, which again, the elevator had been dumped down in the elevator well as a result of this, the water cascades in the elevator well. She very quickly takes on an appreciable pitch, and all of these guys who are clustered on the rear of the flight deck hurtle down the flight deck into that forward elevator well, which is on fire and flooding simultaneously. So it is ghastly. And she goes down with 1,263 men lost. And only a few hundred get off. It's horrific.
And not a good way to go.
Not a good way.
But yeah, echoes of Coral Sea. Can I say scratch 2 flat tops?
Yeah, exactly.
Yep. Yeah, those kills, as we're going to see once we do the next episode, the Mission Beyond Darkness, the submarines put a heavier lick on the Japanese fleet in terms of shipping than does Task Force 58. So kudos to Albacore and Kavala for these epic warship kills in Phil Sea. Guys, let's give our assessments and let's wrap this beast of June 19th, 1944 up. The Japanese raids on the 19th had been, there's no other way to put it, they had been an absolute disaster. Yeah. Aerial losses for the day exceeded an astonishing 350 aircraft from the carriers and land-based aircraft as well. Only 29 American aircraft had been lost during the day, and 4 of those were lost due to mechanical issues and not enemy action. Virtually no damage had been done to American Task Force 58. Minor damage had been sustained on a handful of ships, including the battleship South Dakota, but nothing was very serious in any way, shape, or form. This is, of the 373 aircraft that are launched from Ozawa's carriers, only 130 remained intact. This is a epic beating.
Yeah. Well, okay, so if I may be allowed to riff here, you and I both, when we were doing the notes for this episode, we both used the word Godzilla. And I actually use, when I do this presentation.
Unrelated, by the way.
Unrelated, yeah. I have a slide of Godzilla in my Phil Sea presentation. And, because the bottom line is that Ozawa really fought a pretty good battle. Okay. His tactics were sound. His scouting was excellent. he gets the drop on the enemy, and he gets his attacks off first, which again, by the conventional wisdom of the day, that's the recipe for success. And it didn't do him a lick of good because, Godzilla doesn't care about your tactics, right? Godzilla chuckles at your scouting. You're looking for me? Here I am. You come at me, bro. Because at the end of the day, Godzilla gonna do what Godzilla gonna do. Godzilla is gonna wreck your shiznit, and there is absolutely nothing you can do about it. I mean, the Japanese, for all the good they could have been fighting this battle in biplanes, and they wouldn't have lost in appreciably worse fashion than they actually did, even flying frontline combat aircraft. It's just, again, the whole was much greater than the sum of the parts when it came to America's defenses in this battle. This was the 1985 Bears defense playing against my high school football team. It's any aphorism you want to, it's meant against Cub Scouts. It was a horrific walkover.
Yeah. I mean, it was an epic beating. And, when people think of the turkey shoot, they think of the fighter pilots. And that was one of the reasons that we went so deeply into this, and we always do. But I mean, especially this, truth be told, if the American fighter pilots aren't as good as they were, David McCampbell, Alex Vrashew, Brewer, all these other guys, the results would not have been as hefty. We still would have won, but not to the degree that we did.
Right.
But there was so much more that went into this than just, we got Hellcats and they're really cool aircraft, and we got guys like Alex Vrashew who are natural born hardcore badasses. There's a lot more that went into this whole story, and that's why we poured the resources into this one specifically, because there's a lot more to it than meets the eye.
Yeah, behind the scenes, we look at guys like Vrashew, and rightly so, but there were hundreds of American aviators in this fight who are also extremely well trained, and a lot of them also came away with 1 or 2 kills in these encounters, and probably did it 2 or 3 times that, or whatever. In aggregate, again, just the aggregate results of this thing are just absolutely devastating.
John, on our 3rd episode on Saipan, you talked about the cascading effects inside Japan for the loss of Saipan, right? And all changes in the government and things like that. Was the loss here, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, as deeply felt as the loss of the island had been?
I would say no at the political level, but within the Navy, and we can talk about this now or in the 2nd episode, but Phil C leads directly to the kamikazes, okay? Because everybody in the Navy, the Japanese Navy, understands that conventional attacks just don't work against the Americans anymore. And
against
from a return on investment standpoint, it makes absolutely no sense to train a Japanese carrier aviator for a year or a year and a half just to throw that guy's life away in the course of 1 or 2 combat sorties. It's asinine. So there are a lot of people after this battle that are going to be grappling within the Imperial Navy about, what do we do? There's got to be some other way to come to grips with the Americans using the assets that we now have left to us, which are few. We got a lot of airplanes. We don't have a lot of good pilots now. How are we going to make some lemonade out of this lemon? And so that's going to lead directly to the kamikazes because of the new threat environment that the American Navy has created.
It's pretty significant. It's pretty damn significant. And the fact that the absolute abject slaughter at which I say every single raid, the first 2 and then the 4th raid are subjected to, just proves your Godzilla statement that you can throw everything you have at this force, and we are going to tear your ass up all day long.
Yeah.
And we haven't even attacked yet. We haven't even launched anything to go after their fleet. This is just a defensive maneuver by our fighter planes, for Christ's sakes. We haven't even seen your carriers yet.
Yeah, we're standing on the defensive in in contradiction of everything that everybody knows about carrier warfare, and still just
smash.
And
Just
irony here, again, we said this earlier, Spruance is proven right. Could it have gone any better had we gone on the offensive early in the battle rather than stayed on the defensive and let them come at us?
Yeah, good question. You know, I got challenged on this during one of my history tours when I was out in the Pacific. We had a guy on the tour who was actually a retired Navy fighter pilot. He was like, okay, you know, fine, but could not Spruance have split the difference and said, okay, I want you to send one carrier task force to the west to localize the enemy so that when we have the opportunity to go full bore after him, we'll bring all four of the carrier task groups out there. You know, was there potentially a middle ground that could have been worked out here? I don't know the answer to that question, but I thought it was an intriguing question at least. And it's true that, you know, within the aviation community, the debate is still ongoing as to whether or not Spruance makes the right call or not. Certainly guys like, you know, Jocko Clark were just bitter in their recriminations. You know, Jocko Clark goes to his grave bitter over the opportunity that was missed here. I tend to think that, you know, if you look at Nimitz's reaction and certainly at King's reaction to his decision, to Spruance's decision, and they back him up 100%, certainly at King to the max, that it's kind of tough to say that Spruance made the wrong call here.
I don't think he made the wrong call, but you got to wonder if there was a wrong call or if there was a right call. Because I mean, because of the size of Task Force 58. But and I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves because we're going to talk about this the next time we record and we do that. The results of the American attack on June 20th. You know, I mean, it's. And I've got my own theories on this, and I'll lay those out. But
I'll be interested to hear yours.
But I mean, you know, if we send the kitchen sink at him on the 19th, you know, if we do what Mitscher wants to do, does that actually get any appreciable results? Anything different than what occurs on the 20th? My short answer to that now, and we'll go into detail later, is no. And there's multiple reasons for that, and we'll get into that. But
okay, I'm interested. Yeah, that should be fun.
Yeah. Teaser. So good. What's that, Bill?
Teaser.
Yeah,
that's right.
Next time,
so, come on, but you got to give us the closing quote here.
You know, so I know a guy who used to write for the Times-Picayune here in New Orleans, and he was a movie critic, and he said that sometimes when you'd write something so good, you'd have to get up and like shake it off. You're like, whoa, damn, that was good. In my notes, I wrote one of these lines that I wrote it, and I read it, and I went, no, that was pretty good. So lounging in the ready room, VF-16 aboard Lexington, which was a buzz, needless to say, with excited guys shooting their wristwatches and having conversations. A lieutenant junior grade named Ziggy Neff, great name, Ziggy Neff. He was heard to say, quote, hell, it was like an old-time turkey shoot, unquote, hence the name. Somebody hears this. I believe it was Paul Bowie, the fighter, the squadron commander, who hears this and relays that. And then, of course, it takes on its own life. With the day's slaughter over, Mitscher believed he had earned the right to chase the Japanese the following day. Later that evening, he sends a request to Spruance, quote, desire to attack enemy tomorrow if we know his position with sufficient accuracy, unquote. Finally relenting, Spruance gave the go-ahead, and at 2200, the Big Blue Fleet turned west, opened the throttles wide, and gave chase to Ozawa at a speed of 25 knots. Task Force 58 was on the hunt. There it was. There it was. Well, guys, do you have anything else to add to this absolute epic whipping before we close her out?
No, I got to riff on Godzilla. I'm a happy man. So,
and who doesn't love Godzilla? Everybody loves Godzilla, except for the Japanese. They probably don't like Godzilla too much.
I don't know. I was involved in Godzilla King of Monsters, and the Japanese seemed to like that one pretty well.
Yeah, they wouldn't keep making movies about him
True.
if he wasn't her. Excuse me, her.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
True. Very
they
true.
didn't dig her. Yeah.
Well, with that, we want to thank you very much for listening in on our conversation. Please like and subscribe to our please like and subscribe to our videos and our YouTube channel called the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War Podcast. If you have a question or comment, send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. So once again, my name is Seth Parrott, and I want to thank you very, very much for watching and or listening to us. Happy Thanksgiving to all those out there, by the way. This is going to air after Thanksgiving, but we're recording it Thanksgiving week. As always, John, it's always a pleasure. Glad you are here. And we're going to see you in person in a couple of weeks. It's getting close.
Yes. Looking forward to it.
Yep. Us too. Bill, bring us home.
I'm Bill Tody. See you again next week.